What happens when the familiar becomes foreign? When the sanctuary of your own home transforms into something else? Tonight, I'm sharing 3 true accounts of people who discovered that being alone doesn't always mean being safe. These stories were submitted by viewers who experienced something that defies explanation, something that changed how they see the darkness in their own homes forever. I'm your host at Horror Shadows, and these are their stories. This first story comes from Sarah, a 24-year-old graduate student who moved into a century-old rental house in Salem, Oregon. She'd been living there for 3 months when her parents decided to visit her sister, leaving Sarah completely alone for the first time since moving in. Sarah had always been comfortable with solitude. She'd grown up in the countryside, where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. But this house felt different when empty. The walls seemed to absorb sound differently. The shadows fell at wrong angles. It was Friday night, around 11 p.m. Sarah was in her bedroom on the 2nd floor working on her thesis about medieval burial practices, ironically fitting for what was about to unfold. She'd been typing for hours when she heard it, a soft thud from somewhere below. Now, old houses make noise. Sarah knew this, but this sound, it was different, deliberate, like someone had dropped something heavy and was trying to be quiet about it. Sarah stopped typing and listened. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. She waited 5 minutes before convincing herself it was just the house settling. But then she heard it again and again, always from the basement. Sarah's landlord had mentioned that the basement was mostly storage, old furniture, boxes from previous tenants, that sort of thing. He'd told her she was welcome to use it, but something about the way he'd said it, the way his eyes had shifted when he mentioned it, made her avoid going down there. But now, with those sounds continuing every few minutes, she knew she had to investigate. The basement door was at the end of the kitchen hallway. Sarah had passed it dozens of times, but never opened it. The door was painted the same white as the walls, but somehow it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She grabbed a flashlight. The overhead basement light had never worked, according to the landlord, and slowly turned the doorknob. The smell hit her first. Not just musty or damp, but something else underneath, something organic, something that reminded her of the preserved specimens in her archaeology lab. The wooden stairs groaned under her feet as she descended. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs that seemed too thick, too deliberate, like they'd been cultivated rather than naturally formed. That's when she saw the boxes, dozens of them, stacked in neat rows. But they weren't storage boxes, they were moving boxes, the kind you use when someone's relocated quickly. And they were arranged in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the basement until it landed on something that made her blood freeze. There was a sleeping bag spread out between the boxes, still warm. And next to it, a camping stove with a can of food, still steaming. Sarah spun around, but her flashlight illuminated nothing but empty space. But she could feel it now, the presence of someone else, someone who had been living in her basement, someone who was still down there with her. She backed toward the stairs, but then she heard something that made her knees nearly buckle. Someone was applauding her discovery. Sarah ran. She didn't look back, didn't try to see who was clapping. She just ran up those stairs, slammed the basement door, and shoved the kitchen table against it. She called the police, but when they arrived and searched the basement, they found nothing. No sleeping bag, no camping stove, no boxes arranged in patterns, just empty space and dust. But Sarah knew what she'd seen, and more importantly, she knew what the police didn't find, any other way out of that basement. The person who had been living down there. They were still in the house. Still watching, still waiting. Sarah moved out the next morning. Our second story comes from Marcus, a 31-year-old software engineer who lived alone in a converted warehouse apartment in Detroit. Marcus worked from home, so he was used to spending days without seeing another human being. But on this particular Tuesday in November, He began receiving phone calls that would change his understanding of what it means to be truly alone. It started at 2:17 a.m. Marcus had been debugging code for his latest project when his landline rang. Yes, he still had a landline, a quirk he'd kept from his childhood home. The number was old, unlisted, known only to family and a few close friends. When he answered, there was nothing but static. But underneath the static, something else. Something that sounded almost like whispering. Marcus hung up and went back to work. But 20 minutes later it rang again. Same static, same whispers. This time, though, he could swear he heard his name mixed in with the otherworldly voices. "Marcus! Marcus! Come down!" "Come down? Down where?" Marcus lived on the 4th floor of the converted warehouse. Below him were 3 floors of empty space. The building had been only partially converted, and he was the sole tenant, or so he thought. The calls continued throughout the night. Every 20 to 30 minutes, always the same static, always the same whispers. But as the hours passed, the voices became clearer, more insistent. "Marcus, come down, we're waiting." By dawn, Marcus was exhausted and terrified. He'd stopped answering the phone, but it kept ringing, and the voices were getting louder, more demanding. That's when Marcus realized something that made his skin crawl. He could hear the ringing even when he was in rooms far from the phone. The sound was coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the floors, the ceiling. The entire building was ringing, but it wasn't just ringing. It was singing. A low, harmonic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building. Marcus grabbed his laptop and did something he'd never done before. He accessed the building's security system. The warehouse had cameras on every floor, installed by the previous owner who'd never removed them. What he saw on those screens destroyed his sense of reality. Every floor below him was occupied, not by tenants, but by figures, dozens of them, standing in perfect rows, all facing the same direction, all facing up, all looking toward his floor, and they were all holding phones. Marcus watched in horror as the figures on the screens began to move in perfect synchronization. They were walking toward the stairwells, still holding their phones, still making that collective ringing sound. But here's what made Marcus's blood turn to ice. The figures weren't walking. They were gliding, moving without their feet touching the ground, ascending the stairs in perfect formation. Marcus ran to his door and checked the locks. All secure, but the ringing was getting louder now, coming from directly outside his apartment. He looked through the peephole and saw them. They were standing in the hallway, dozens of them, all holding phones to their ears, all looking directly at his door, all smiling. The knocking was soft at first, almost polite, but then it multiplied. Dozens of hands, all knocking in perfect rhythm. And underneath the knocking, Marcus could hear them whispering his name. "Marcus, we called you. You didn't come, so we came to you." Marcus grabbed his keys and ran to the fire escape. He climbed down 4 floors, jumped the last 8 feet, and ran to his car. He drove to the nearest hotel and stayed there for 3 days. When he finally returned to collect his belongings, the building was empty. The security cameras showed nothing but vacant floors. But his phone bill from that night showed something impossible. 47 outgoing calls to his own number, all made from inside his apartment, all made while he was alone. Marcus never found out who had been calling him, but he learned something about his building that the real estate agent had conveniently forgotten to mention. It used to be a telephone switching station, and in 1987, there had been a fire. 47 operators had died at their posts, still connected to their calls. Marcus moved out that same day. Our final story comes from Elena, a 28-year-old art restorer who inherited her grandmother's Victorian house in Savannah, Georgia. Elena had visited the house many times as a child, but she'd never been allowed in the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. Her grandmother had always kept it locked, claiming it was just storage. But when Elena inherited the house, she found something among her grandmother's possessions that would explain why that room had been forbidden. The key was ornate, made of what looked like black iron with symbols carved into it that Elena didn't recognize. Attached to it was a note in her grandmother's handwriting.
Elena, mi querida, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found the key. I pray you will be wise enough to leave the mirror room sealed. But I know you, child. You were always too curious for your own good. If you must open it, remember, never look directly into the mirrors after sunset, and never ever spend the night in that room alone.
Elena stared at the note for a long time. Mirror room? She'd assumed the locked room was just storage, but mirrors? And why the warning about sunset? Her curiosity, as her grandmother had predicted, won out. Elena climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered, stretching endlessly toward the forbidden door. Each step on the hardwood floor echoed strangely, as if the sound was being reflected back from multiple directions. The door was painted deep burgundy, almost black, and there were scratches around the keyhole. Deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at the door from the inside. The room was octagonal, with no windows, and every single wall was covered in mirrors. Not modern mirrors, but old, antique ones with ornate frames. Some were tall and narrow, others were wide and squat. They were all different sizes, different shapes, but they all reflected the same thing. Elena, standing in the doorway, repeated infinitely in every direction. It was beautiful in a way that made her skin crawl. The reflections created a tunnel effect, with dozens of Elenas stretching into impossible distances. She stepped into the room, and the effect intensified. Every movement was multiplied. Every breath was reflected back at her from countless angles. Elena spent hours in that room, fascinated by the optical illusions created by the mirrors. She noticed that some of the reflections seemed delayed, as if the light was taking longer to bounce back from certain mirrors. And some of the reflections seemed off, slightly different from what she was actually doing. It was 6 p.m. when Elena heard the clock chime from downstairs. Sunset was approaching, and she remembered her grandmother's warning. She should leave. But something kept her there, drawn to the mirrors like a moth to flame. As the light outside began to fade, Elena noticed something that made her heart race. The mirrors were starting to reflect things that weren't there. In one mirror she saw herself, but her reflection was wearing a different dress. A Victorian dress, high-necked and black, like something her grandmother might have worn as a young woman. In another mirror her reflection was older, with gray hair and lines around her eyes. But this older Elena was crying, pressing her hands against the glass as if trying to escape. And in the largest mirror, the one directly across from where she stood, her reflection was missing entirely. The mirror showed an empty room, but Elena could see herself standing there in all the other mirrors. That's when Elena heard the whispers. At first, she thought it was her own voice, echoing strangely in the mirrored room. But as she listened closer, she realized it was multiple voices, all speaking in unison.
Elena, look at us. Look at what you could become. Look at what you are.
Elena spun around, trying to find the source of the voices, but every movement created a cascade of reflections. The room was spinning, the mirrors were multiplying, and she couldn't tell which reflection was real and which was something else. That's when she saw them. In every mirror, standing behind her reflections, were other people. Dozens of them, all wearing different clothing from different eras. All staring at her with the same desperate expression. And she recognized some of them. Family members, people from old photographs, people who had been dead for decades. The mirrors began to crack, thin lines spreading across the surface like spider webs. But the cracks weren't random. They were forming patterns, symbols, the same symbols that had been carved into the key. Elena ran for the door, but when she reached it, it was gone. The doorway was now just another mirror, reflecting her terrified face back at her. She was trapped in a room of infinite reflections, with the dead staring at her from every angle. Elena closed her eyes and recited a prayer her grandmother had taught her years ago, a prayer in Spanish that she'd never understood. As she spoke the words, she felt the room change around her. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the hallway, outside the mirror room. The door was closed and locked, and the key was in her hand. Elena looked down at her hands and saw something that made her blood freeze. Her reflection in the hallway mirror was still wearing that Victorian dress, and it was smiling. Elena sealed the mirror room permanently the next day. She had the door bricked over and the key melted down. But sometimes, late at night, she can still hear the whispers coming from inside the walls. And when she passes by mirrors in other parts of the house, she sometimes sees them. Elena still lives in her grandmother's house, but she's covered every mirror with cloth and she never looks at her reflection after sunset. These 3 stories remind us that being alone doesn't always mean being safe. Sometimes the most terrifying encounters happen not in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but in the places we call home, in the spaces where we should feel most secure. Sarah discovered that her sanctuary had been invaded. Marcus learned that sometimes the dead refused to disconnect. And Elena found that some family secrets are locked away for good reason. If you have a true horror story you'd like to share, send it to me through the email in the description below. Your story might be featured in a future episode of Horror Shadows. Remember to subscribe for more true horror stories and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Because in the darkness you never know who might be watching or waiting. Until next time, stay safe and never trust the shadows.